want to take the opportunity to thank VARTA, to thank Kate, especially Kate Bourne, and Louise Johnson for having me here today. It is such an honor to be able to be here to learn from VARTA, hopefully to learn from you as well. I am from a very small program in the US that's unlike any other sperm bank that's over there. And we are the oldest place that has been doing open identity donation, and pretty much up until I came across VARTA, doing it on our own. So finding VARTA was like finding Mecca. I have to acknowledge my collaborators, Emily McCormick, who was my former undergrad student, Alice Ruby, who's the executive director of the Sperm Bank of California, which I'll call TSBC, and Jean Benward, who is a mental health professional. Kate asked me to talk about the things that I've learned from 10 years of linking. We had a paper come out recently about the first 10 years of linking between donor-conceived adults and donors. But Kate told me I had to dig deeper. So I've also included some preliminary data for those of you who read the paper and would be bored otherwise. So the three major things that I've learned since working with this program, Open Identity Donation, since 1999, is that basically, although you can hope for the best, you have to prepare for the worst. And I can just preempt this by saying that most of the time things turn out well, but there are times where you really must prepare. And what that means is for all stakeholders to have resources available to them, to have information to help create community, and to try to provide, and also to have access to mental health professionals. The second thing was we didn't know what would happen when people started asking for their donor's identity in 2001. But what we found over time with 175 releases is that it's clear that for the adults that are at the Sperm Bank of California, so I'm going to talk about this sample at the Sperm Bank. I am not talking for any other sample. For the group of people that have contacted us, the donor and the origins that he represents holds considerable significance. That seems to be a given for people who are contacting us. But how that plays out is quite variable. And what we see in the media tends to be like the best of the best or the worst of the worst. And my data seem to be showing that there's a lot of people in between. And finally, what we call donor-linked peer contact has turned out to be invaluable. What I mean by that is when an adult shares a donor with another adult, so people from different families. Wendy Kramer's called this donor siblings. We call them peers because they tend to be the same age, but they're not necessarily family to each other, so we don't use the word sibling. It's especially important because the other experience that I've noticed is that for families, especially heterosexual couple families, I have seen a sense of isolation when the adults come forward, and even for the parents themselves. And for the adults, the contact with their donor-linked peers has been invaluable in relieving some of this isolation. Okay, so this is linking up one program in the US. The context is that still disclosure varies among heterosexual couples. Some samples, like ours, indicate 65% of parents tell, but there's some other samples, like Scheib, that show 25% are only telling. For single moms and same-sex couples, they will eventually tell their kids. There's limited regulation in the US, unbelievably limited compared to Victorian. And if there are open identity programs in the US, that's because now I'm talking only sperm banks, that's because the Sperm Bank has decided to offer it. What their program looks like is not going to be the same as the next program. But now, I think it's primarily due to parental requests. Over 50% of programs offer open identity donation, but it's in the context of dual track, which means that still the majority of their donors are anonymous. How they release is dependent on the program. The one exception is TSBC, where the program is all open identity, but that's only recent. That hasn't always been the case. Okay, the other context that I have to set is that TSBC TSBC is a small nonprofit. It came out of a feminist women's health collective originally. It was created for women who do not have male partners, and they were being denied access at all the other DI programs. So the Oakland Women's Feminist Health Collective created the TSBC in 1982 for these women, and the proportion of same-sex female couples is and has remained since the beginning about 60%. Single moms tend to be about 20%, and then there's a small proportion of heterosexual couples. It was created for different needs. So the context is different in the sense that most of these individuals came to the sperm bank because they could not find somebody that they knew, a known donor. And they were reluctant to use the sperm bank because they did not want to cut ties for their children. And yet they were in this situation where especially lesbian couples had had the parental rights of the parent without the genetic link challenged. In fact, sometimes both of their parental rights have been challenged. So there were serious risks to them. So the solution to that was to create what we call the Identity Release Program, which provided access to the donor's identity and his contact information. But it did not necessarily, there was no guarantee of being able to contact the donor or a relationship. The idea was it was access to information. The second part of it was that only adults could access it because that way it protected the parental rights of their parents. Okay, so basically the slides are packed and I'm gonna scream through them to get the good bits. So basically, hope for the best, prepare means lots of information and explaining the limits of future identifiability. So what we were finding was that some people would think, some parents would think, all it means is my child's going to be able to find out who my donor is. That's the identity release part. Other parents thought that they could tell their child that they could meet their dad when they turned 18. On the other hand, we had donors who felt like if they signed up to be identity released, that meant that they could meet their kids when they turned 18. But we also had donors who felt like all they had to do was release their identity and nothing else. And the key thing here was to be able to make sure that people understood there was considerable variability. I can tell you now from some interviews we've done that it looks like most of the time if people ask for their donor's identity, what they're planning to do is to try to contact him. Okay, jump ahead 18 years. We had the first releases in 2002, and we implemented a protocol. And for the donors, what that meant was that we requested information from them before anybody even would be eligible for their information. So all donors would be contacted a year in advance, and we would ask them to update us on what is happening with their families and if their partners know and if they have children and what has happened, if they're still lab techs at the university or have moved on. We'd also asked for medical updates because we only had a snapshot in time. We do have periodic updates now, but in the beginning we did not. And we also, most importantly, the donor-conceived adolescents that we talked to in 2000 had asked that we provide information about the donor's openness to contact because they didn't want to contact the donor and find out he wasn't open. So what I call the update are these updated information, a rating scale of how open are they from 1 to 5, 5 being most open, how they want to be contacted the first time somebody wants to reach them, and they can have a message too. The the amount of information we provide and a consult with a mental health professional is something that's developed over time. We had information obviously, but the consult with the mental health professional wasn't always there. And when we after the 10-year research study, we discovered that was really important. Not everybody takes it up, but it has to be accessible. Okay, so I can come back to that later. That's just an update. For the adults, what they have to do is they go through a multi-step process. And typically, about 75% of the people who apply will complete the process within 3 months. Many complete it within a month. They have to put in the request for writing. There's several steps. When they first contact the Sperm Bank, they're provided with information about what identity release is, what they'll receive, and we've now learned that we need to tell them about what we call the family contact list. So that's the registry that's a lot like your voluntary registry in the sense, except that it's only for parents and donor-conceived adults. And if they're interested, they sign up and we will link them with any other adult that's on there or family who shares their donor. That has turned out to be a really important step. Then they submit their forms, and at the second meeting, Alice Ruby, the director, goes through information about the donor, his openness to contact. And when things go badly, she also, again, provides the resources, but when things go badly, and I'll talk about what that is, a lot of time is spent on resources and trying to provide support. Again, the mental health professional consult is offered, but what we're seeing is that when things go unexpectedly and adults' expectations don't match what their donors are, they tend to turn to not only their families, but their donor-linked peers. And we've had 85 releases so far. Okay, so the 10-year study that's already been published, what we saw was that somewhere between 30 and 40% of adults who were eligible for information from 2001 up until 2011 actually requested that information. And I can talk later about, what that number's about, but we do incorporate the possibility, we know that some heterosexual couples are not telling their children about their family's origins. What that represents is that 68% of the donors had their identities released within that time period. Most often adults requested the information when they were right away, when they became eligible at 18 or 19. They wanted information, they wanted to know what the donor looked like, whether they looked like him, and wanted to explore other shared characteristics. And in general, it seems like what they're doing is, another part of it is they're exploring origins information that's really related to identity development, a normal psychological process we all go through. But it's also, what they're also doing is they're trying to explore the meaning of the link that they have with their donor. Because we are all pioneers in this. We're all learning what this means. We don't know. There are differences across the families. What we saw was, much like you, women tend to be the ones who are making the requests. However, if you look at it by family type, that bias disappears in two other families where it's about equal numbers of men and women who are making requests for their donor's identity. We thought that 30 to 40% wasn't a lot, given the teenagers had told us that they were, over 90% of them had planned to request their donor's identity. But then when we went back, so what we find is if you split it up again by family type, and I've done that because I know most of your data is focused on heterosexual couple families. When I split it up, what we saw was if you came from a solo mom family, you'd be most likely to make a request, followed by if you came from a two-mom family, and you'd be least likely to if you had a heterosexual couple family. And that's not because parents aren't telling. I have controlled for that in this slide. This is among people who do know. So I went back and looked at the teenager data of what they said when we were planning for the releases. And what I discovered was that among the heterosexual couples, only 17% of them said that they thought they would come forward when they became eligible. Most of them had no idea when. So I do think that what's going to happen is we're going to get another wave of people requesting. We've started to see it. Now we're seeing the older ones requesting their donor's identity, and we are also seeing the impact of people using DNA testing. There's more people from heterosexual couples coming forward. Okay, so once they got their donor's identity, most of them planned to contact their donor. They kept their expectations low, but they weren't sure when they would go ahead. really conditional upon what the donor said is the best description of it. I like this quote because it captures it. I think it'll depend on how I feel at each stage. It'll depend on what happens. My intention is to have at least one conversation. Going to the donor's openness to being contacted. In that sample, all but 4 donors were expecting and open to be contacted by adults, and the vast majority of them had provided updates, so information about their life, how they wanted to be contacted. Most of them were open to being contacted. There were 4 people, 4 donors who were against contact. There were 2 that were against contact and 2 who we could not reach. And we did get contact preferences for the ones we could reach, but despite that, they did not want any contact. And so in the previous slide, what you see is that they're not sure, maybe they're going to contact their donor. What was interesting was the adult response when that choice was taken away. The 4 adults who had obtained those donors' identity were incredibly upset and disappointed, and it was very clear that the donor was more than just simply his name, last known contact, birthday, and whatnot. And here again, what really helped these individuals was contact with their peers. Okay, so we've just finished interviewing adults who had releases between 2002 and 2014. Obviously, there's a lot of overlap with that 10-year study. This is not published yet. This is Kate's fault. These are people we interviewed them anywhere from 2 to 11 years after they had had a release. The median was 5 years after. Again, most were women. Again, most of them came from 2-mother families. Most of them, the release process they were really happy with. 80% of them felt the update gave them a lot or all the info they wanted. And in fact, 5 of them, 5 years after getting their donor's identity, still haven't reached out to their donor. They're happy with what they received. 85% of them went on to try to contact their donor. 47% of the sample are in contact with donor-linked peers, some of whom were linked when they were getting their donor's identity, and some of whom were linked by the donor. That was unexpected. And then in terms of reaching the donor, of the entire sample, 3/4 reached their donor. They had said, I'm not sure when. Well, in fact, 63% reached out within a month. 25% of them did so the same day they received the information. So it's really conditional. Let's see what the donor says. 47% of them have ongoing contact with their donor. That means that there's 53% who don't. And where this is informative is that, okay, so in the 53%, there are 5 of them or 7 of them, there are 5 of them who haven't been able to reach their donor. But there are lots of people in the sample who no longer have ongoing contact, who have had really good experiences with their donor. They can contact him if they want to, but they don't have ongoing contact with him the way they do with their parents and friends. Okay, I'm going to wrap up. The last thing is that in general, there was lots of variability in people's experiences with their donor. But getting the donor's identity, the identity release process, nobody regretted that. They were all quite at least neutral about it, if not quite happy. Donor-linked peers improved their experience. This was even more so when they didn't click with their donor or the donor was unreceptive. It is really reassuring to me that the solutions that we came up with at TSBC are much like what we see at VARTA. So thank you, VARTA.